Good evening. Welcome to both our in-person and virtual audiences to the beautiful and newly opened Arts Collaborative in downtown Waterville. My name is Gail Carlson, and I'm the director of Colby's Buck Lab for Climate and Environment and a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program. I'm pleased to offer a few introductory remarks about the exciting collaboration between the Buck Lab and Colby's Lunder Institute for American Art that has brought us to this moment, in which our students will be leading us through incredible visual storytelling along Maine's environmental timeline. First, I would like to acknowledge that Colby College is situated in the homeland of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which includes the Micmac, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations. We express our respect to the indigenous communities, past, present, and future, of these ancestral lands. We recognize the legacies and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism, and we commit to building lasting relationships with the Wabanaki. We understand that acknowledgement alone is not sufficient, but must be accompanied by action to support reconciliation, tribal sovereignty, the restoration of polluted and degraded lands and waters, and respect for the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, sacred places, knowledge systems, traditions, and physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being. At Colby, the Buck Lab for Climate and Environment provides a nexus for students, faculty, staff, and community partners to collaborate in innovative and broad-reaching ways on environmental scholarship, engagement, stewardship, and advocacy to inspire the next generation of environmental leaders. The Lunder Institute is a collaborative initiative with the Colby Museum of Art. It invites visiting artists, scholars, and museum professionals to engage across disciplines with members of the Colby community, institutional partners, leading experts, and other creative collaborators to amplify marginalized voices, challenge convention, and provide a platform for dialogue through art and scholarship. This is the second year of an exciting and, for many students, transformative collaboration between the Buck Lab and the Lunder Institute. This partnership signals our commitment to intellectual explorations at the intersections of the arts, humanities, natural, and social sciences that incorporate diverse ways of knowing and representations of the world to better understand environmental problems and their solutions. We also value the key role of the arts in public awakenings on critically important issues in the public domain, including the climate crisis, threats to biodiversity and human well-being, and the erosion of unexploited places. The first Buck Lab Lunder Institute collaboration was in the fall of 2019 when we organized a special guided tour for students through the Colby Museum of Art's exhibit entitled Occupy Colby, Artists Need to Create on the Same Scale That Society Has the Capacity to Destroy. The tour was led by the exhibit's curator, Fong Bui, who was a Lunder Institute fellow at the time. In keeping with Occupy Colby's overarching theme of climate change, after the tour, Mr. Bui accompanied students to the flagpole at the center of campus for a climate strike, one of many simultaneous youth-led rallies around the world, and he documented the event on film, which can actually be seen on his website. This year, the Buck Lab and the Lunder Institute have co-sponsored a student internship program linked to the work of renowned artist Maya Lin, currently a senior fellow at the Lunder Institute. This program was designed to be collaborative, bringing together two students, one from environmental studies and one from the visual arts, to research Maine's environmental history and contribute stories to Maya Lin's What Is Missing project, a multi-sided multimedia global memorial to the planet. As you will see, What Is Missing documents shared stories from around the world and bears witness to environmental crises as they unfold, simultaneously raising awareness about our present and reserving hope for our future. Colby was very fortunate 5 years ago to have Maya Lin visit campus as an artist in residence, and in her public lecture in a jam-packed Lorimer chapel, she spoke passionately about her commitment to environmental stewardship. The next morning, she spoke to the 75 or so students in our introductory environmental studies course, and when I walked into the lecture hall that morning, I was so pleased to see Paula and Peter Lunder sitting among the students. Maya Lin told stories from the What Is Missing website, and she beckoned us to engage and assist her in this work by saying, quote, "Talk to me," and by asking students for their stories and their memories. At the time, she expressed interest in working with Colby students to build an environmental timeline of Maine, and here we are today, 5 years later, her wish having come to fruition. So before I introduce the interns who have done this amazing work, I would like to thank a number of people who have helped make this experience possible. First of all, Maya Lin, Lunder Institute Senior Fellow, Casey Carter and Alexandra Jones, researchers on the What is Missing project, Jessamine Batario of the Lunder Institute, who has closely mentored the students all year, Kara Kugelmeyer, Data Services Librarian at Colby, Colby Museum of Art staff members Megan Carey and Chris Patch, and student Kanan Shambora, who helped with the Maine timeline installation, Professor Bradley Borthwick of the Colby Art Department, who worked with Jessamine and myself on the intern selection process, and of course, Peter and Paula Lunder, and Sandy and Sissy Buck. And finally, tonight's talk would not be possible without the invaluable staff from Colby's Information Technology Services, who have helped us navigate the world of online events for over a year now, so we thank you very, very much. 2 housekeeping notes. First, for our virtual audience, there is closed captioning, which you can enable by clicking on the closed captioning button on the bottom right side of your Zoom window. And second, there will be a Q&A at the end of the program. For our virtual audience, please enter your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and someone on site will read it aloud for you. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce our panelists. Jessamine Batario is the Linde Family Foundation Curator of Academic Engagement at the Colby Museum of Art and the Lunder Institute. She has worked closely with the students all year and will be moderating the conversation tonight. And our 2020-2021 Lunder-Buck interns are, in the middle, junior Helen Bennett, who's an independent major in architecture and design with a minor in physics from Princeton, New Jersey, and senior Cal Waichler, who is an environmental science major from Winthrop, Washington. They will be speaking about their collaborative work on the What is Missing project and putting Maine on the map of memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, for that introduction. I'm really, really pleased to be here tonight with Cal and Helen because, as Gail said, we have been working all year on this project. It's been an extraordinary year, and perhaps mainly for us because we've had this opportunity to work with Maya Lin on this project, What is Missing. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with What is Missing, it's multi-sided, it's multimedia. It takes the form of specific art installations in various places, ephemeral takeovers of public places, special installations and exhibitions, and of course, the website, which acts as a living archive, a map of memory that contains a lot of videos and content about endangered and extinct species, and it also contains memories from the community, as well as environmental history timelines. And that's what this group of students contributed to, is timelines specifically. And so my first question is actually to Helen. Why are there so many timelines on the map of memory? Why is history so important to What is Missing?
Absolutely. I would say that history is super critical to this project. With each new generation, there's kind of an establishment of a new normal and kind of a new understanding of the environment and the way that things have changed. And a lot of the time we kind of forget the way that things were and adapt to the way things are now. And I think this project really raises the idea of kind of recognizing what has come before us and the way that things have developed over time and how certain species are no longer in existence and habitats are no longer in existence. And so Maya's team refers to this as shifting baselines. And yeah, I would say that each timeline kind of is really displays this well in terms of understanding what's here and what's no longer around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shifting baselines is kind of a really crucial idea to why timelines even exist. One idea that Maya likes to, or one illustration of this concept that Maya likes to show is actually on the wall behind us. It's kind of the image of the cod, the Atlantic cod. In the late 19th century, for example, the cod, the biggest cod ever caught was over 200 pounds. It's the size of a man. But more recently, in 2008, the cod is like really small, something like 12 or 15 pounds. And so today we think and we accept that the cod is like this small fish when historically it's been so much bigger, and we've just never noticed that gradual change over time. And so the timelines really convey that change, that shift, making us question the baselines we accept today. So you guys worked on timelines a lot, not just the main timeline. So Cal, I'm wondering if you could give us an overview of the specific timelines you worked on all year.
Yeah. In the fall, we started with the main timeline, creating it from scratch. And that was the full semester, researching original content for the main timeline. And then this spring, Helen and I started developing 3 regional timelines for North America, the West, the Midwest, and the Northeast, curating from existing entries about waterways and cities that other people have made timelines for, but boiling that down even further into regional pools. And then recently revisiting this for the installation. And there were a ton of skills and methods that we utilized in our research, from going to special collections at the Colby Library and digging through primary sources, looking through these old books for interesting quotes and images, to navigating the incredible wealth of information on the web and the online repositories of like digitized texts. For instance, like old hunting and trapping journals hold really cool accounts of like species abundance, which we'll touch on later, I think. And then there was also the image search process, which again, we were pulling from different pools. The Colby Museum of Art was the source of a lot of these images that you see. And then online sources are where we found the rest. And we quickly learned that Crown copyright is an issue, where images in the last 50 years, many of them aren't usable in the public domain. So it was actually hardest to find like modern photographs and images. Everything older than 1970 was available for use. So we learned a lot through that process. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And as Gail said, this internship was designed to be collaborative from the start. So we have the two of you, somebody in the visual arts, Helen in architecture and design, and Cal, you're in environmental studies. And so you've worked together. But not only that, but you've also worked with lots of other people. You've worked with people in the Colby Museum, you've worked with the Colby Libraries, and of course there's Maya and her team of researchers. And so really, it was collaboration from the start all year long. So I'm wondering, Helen, if you could talk to us about the collaborative process that guided this whole project. What was it like to work with Cal, but also with people inside and outside of Colby?
Sure. I would say prior to this year, I didn't really have a lot of experience with environmental studies, and I've definitely learned a lot from Cal in that regard, in terms of establishing key issues for certain areas and regions, kind of taking note of conservation issues, and just being very mindful about that. And it's been really fun to work with someone who also kind of has some background in the studio arts. And I think we've definitely kind of used both of our skill sets to our advantages in terms of collaborating, which has been really exciting for me. So Cal and I have also worked with Kara Kugelmeyer, who's one of the librarians at Colby, in terms of kind of learning some of those research methods that you were talking about, and finding entries that we had ideas about, but not necessarily a strategy to acquire them. And definitely imagery, she was very helpful with that, and also kind of organizing those after they were found. And then with working with Casey and Alex, that was really exciting, and definitely we learned a lot from that, and they were super helpful in terms of reviewing our progress and giving us a lot of assignments and communicating Maya's wishes for the project and areas where we could expand more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can I tack on? Working with Helen has also been like such a pleasure. I didn't know either Jessamine or Helen before this year, and both have been like incredible research partners. And we all kind of jumped into the project, not knowing a lot about what is missing, having encountered it, but not being super familiar with how it's constructed. So the three of us learned a lot together, and Helen's eye for detail and like really organized research was super helpful. And then my experience working with Alex and Casey was also very cool. They're, in my mind, just like model interdisciplinary scholars and researchers. They have this wealth of knowledge about, like, they seem to know everything about American environmental history and can provide really nuanced suggestions to the content in the timelines. And they also have such a sensitivity for art. So for me, having interdisciplinary interests, working with them was an amazing window into this space where art and science are working together to great effect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, at first I think kind of how we started before we even met with Maya and Alex and Casey is like, okay, let's like familiarize ourselves with what is missing. And so we had like the first week or two, it was just conversations about reading about what is missing and just thinking about the project conceptually, like why is it so important, what's it about, and all these other things. And then we dove right in. And then you guys built a Maine timeline from scratch, which is no small feat. And so how does one even start doing that? Cal, I'm wondering, can you talk to us about or tell us about how the two of you chose which narratives to highlight?
Sure. At first, we were just getting the gist for Maine's environmental history, looking at broad overviews, and conservation organizations had some really useful information on their websites. And once we had a big picture, we looked for key issues, extinct and endangered species, and then key habitats. And through the cultivation of those themes, we dug deeper into certain narratives within Maine's history. And some of those stories popped up in like previous classes or work I've done at Colby, like the history of Maine's forests is one thing that I studied, and I knew that the trajectory from these great forests to clearing them and taking the logs away and and then grazing or using the land for agriculture, and then this swift abandonment. I knew that that arc of land use would come into play in the timeline, something uniquely sort of New England and Maine. And then other issues and themes emerged just as we did the research, and we found really amazing sources that illuminated elements of Maine's past that I wouldn't have expected.
And then one of the kind of like guiding points for the whole timeline was the Wabanaki creation story, right?
Right, yeah, so the story of the Wabanaki people emerging from the ash tree is one that really carried the timeline because it connects to the current issue of invasive species with the emerald ash borer, and it reflects that history of forests. And another issue that really tied things together was the issue of obsolete dams. And as we looked into that, there's accounts from pre-settlement times through to settlement and the perceptions of abundance with all of the fish coursing through the rivers and the ability of early explorers to like walk across the Penobscot on the backs of salmon, and later the depletion of those stocks and the awareness that something was amiss, and finally conservation action, and leading into the 1992 dam removal on the Kennebec River was this really pivotal moment in environmental history. It was the first major dam removal in the United States, setting the precedent for kind of these dam removals that we see today. So yeah, digging into the Maine timeline and finding ways that it also connects to the nation at large and so many species and people and habitats unfolded as we researched.
Yeah. So what you did is you researched Maine, but you found out how it connected to I guess, the larger world. And it's really cool to think about how like we in this state kind of started that trend of taking down dams that are obsolete. So that's really neat. And in thinking about kind of like the larger world or the larger audience, you have these frameworks in mind, you know, the Wabanaki creation story, narratives about waterways and dams, deforestation and regeneration. So that's what guided you, and you began compiling textual entries, text and image entries, and to make that timeline. So what I'm hoping to hear from Helen actually is the conceptual side of this process and the public audience that it's trying to reach. It's not just trying to reach scientists, it's not just trying to reach people interested in art, it's really trying to reach like the broadest range of people possible. So I'm wondering, how does What is Missing actually visualize history? What makes for a good entry? The timelines consist of pairings of text and image, but it's so much more than that. It's not just a matter of compiling like some historical text and pairing it with an image that kind of matches. There's so much more.
Sure. I think one of my favorite elements of this project is kind of how accessible it is and how you can access it online and also in person the way we're doing now. And it's just very inviting, and kind of anyone with a device can gain access to it. And I think a lot of Maya's works do that really well in terms of being placed within public settings and even in museums. I think they're definitely very inviting and unintimidating, but still elegant and thought-provoking. Yeah, and I think in terms of what makes a good entry, I would say my favorite entries on the timeline are probably the ones, well, I think we try to do this with all of them, but I'd say where the image and the text work super well together, where they enhance one another and raise questions about kind of the timeline and the narrative as a whole. Yeah.
Yeah. Something I like to think about is, what if what is missing was just text? Or what if what is missing was just a series of images? It would be really incomplete. You might be looking at a bunch of images and think like, oh, these are pretty pictures, but you have no clue like what it's even about. And if it was just text, you'd have a lot of information, a lot of historical information, and it might feel really dense. And so the pairing of the two actually makes it super, not only effective, but affective. Then you can have an emotional connection to it when things are paired. It's really all about connections. And so actually, this is art and science working together, as you mentioned earlier, Cal. And when art and science are working together, or when you're doing this in kind of a transdisciplinary way, one kind of common tension that arises is, the relationship between subjectivity on the one hand and objectivity on the other. So something we've talked about all year long actually is this tension. And a lot of the voices that you see in the timelines, these are taken from primary source materials. These are people's voices. And so how do these first person accounts, how do they both illuminate and complicate environmental histories?
Great question, and something that I don't think we're done wrestling with, but the personal accounts are really engaging, and some are very emotional, grappling with abundance or loss and those themes. They can also seem untruthful or almost make you doubt the contents of what they're saying. Like, there's an entry from Manhattan that the lobsters were 6 feet long, which is incomprehensible to me. Maybe that's just the baseline that I'm living with, but when I don't know, there's a moment when you see that and you start to question, have things actually changed this much? But I think that's a small issue compared to the power and narrative within the individual's perspectives and stories.
Yeah, there's different kinds of knowledge. I mean, there's value in non-scientific knowledge.
Yes. Yeah, so this kind of timeline is an opportunity to tell the story from a non-scientific perspective. It's not an overview environmental history. You get a dose of so many different people who were there, who were experiencing it in their daily lives. And that lends a lot of flavor and character to the timeline. And even the shift in language and the words that people use over time, similar to the images, like there's no photographs earlier in the timeline because cameras didn't exist. So this paired the quote and the image together, they have an aesthetic that really transports you back to someone else's life in a different time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you take a closer look and you look at some of the earlier entries, you'll notice kind of like that old English kind of vibe to it. And at first you're thinking like, wait, is this misspelled? No, this is a faithful like reproduction of these people's voices, their words. And yeah, and something that has always stayed with me actually as we've been talking about these issues is, this is an environmental history timeline of Maine, and something that Alex has been talking or has been saying to us is that history by definition is exclusionary, because you're making choices as to which voices to amplify and which voices to exclude. And so we tried to be as inclusive as possible in this history to represent a wide range of voices. And so you have a lot of different voices in this timeline, and we've come across like certain problems even thinking about that in the curatorial part, right, Helen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because we started with so many entries and had to kind of pare down for the installation timeline, we noticed at one point that we had no entries by women, and ended up having to re-include a lot, or I think, yeah, just like having to reincorporate those into, just to make sure that kind of everyone, a more wide range of perspectives were present. And that was just like something interesting to notice for sure.
I mean, that's just kind of a feature of doing historical research, is like you begin to notice what voices have been preserved. And they tend to be male, they tend to be white from the settler perspective. But in this timeline, we really tried we were very conscious of that and thinking about how to fix that, and to include more women, to include the Indigenous perspective, and to do it responsibly, hopefully. But since we were talking about the curatorial aspect of this, let's pivot to the curatorial and this installation. So the actual Maine timeline itself, I would like everyone to know, it actually consists of 80 entries. That's how much research these two did over the year, 80 entries of text and images. And so for the installation, it was boiled down to 20 entries. So Helen, since you're kind of more interested in kind of the museum aspect and a possible career in a museum and the curatorial practice, I'd love to hear from you about that process, about the process of trimming that research down from 80 to 20, and also about working on the installation itself.
Sure. So Cal and I met one morning in the museum after kind of taking a break from the Maine timeline for a little while and focusing more on the regional timelines that we've been working on this spring. And we decided to kind of start by pulling out some themes that we thought contributed well and were kind of some of the most powerful ones in the original 80 entries. Those were kind of the Indigenous voices, and the presence of the ash borer, and then also bounty, deforestation, forest regeneration, conservation successes, and pollution, as well as just kind of the waterways, which are so important to Maine. And then following that, kind of the narrative was taking on a little bit of a different shape, obviously, because the entries that usually were in between the ones that we had selected were no longer there. So we worked on retitling some of the entries and finding images that were a little bit larger in scale, that would work well visually, not on a screen, because that's kind of where we were used to seeing them a little bit before. And we were able to work with Megan Carey in the museum to kind of format some of those and work with people in the museum on the installation.
And even that was collaborative as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It was neat to see everybody kind of put it on the wall.
Yeah, it was really helpful, especially to get a lot of feedback from you and Alex and Casey about filling in holes within our condensed timeline and making sure that the narratives that we had originally established were still there.
Great. Well, before we actually turn to questions from the audience, what I'd love to do is ask you guys to share some highlights. Can each of you share maybe an entry that really spoke to you personally or individually, and tell us why it did?
Absolutely. My favorite entry is about the large sea minks, which went extinct around 1900 or 1880. And this quote is from a man named Manly Hardy, whose family was in the business of fur trading for at least 75 years before this quote, which is from 1903. And so Manly Hardy's a fur trapper, and this quote says, "Many of the mink were fully twice as large as the mink from inland. I remember frequently hearing them spoken of as being as large as small cats. These sea mink were usually extremely fat, and the skins had an entirely different smell from that of the woods mink. I could, with my eyes shut, pick them out from the woods mink by their peculiar smell." And he continues, "The mink which are now taken on our sea coast along Penobscot Bay are quite large, and the fur is coarse, but we get none of the great sea mink like those taken 40 or more years ago." This quote exemplifies so many whim things, what is missing things for me. The particulars of the stench and the size of the mink evoke its character, and like you can sense it with that description. It also hints at this story within conservation and wildlife conservation, where the kind of the rarer a fur gets or a species is, the more valuable it is as a resource, and that further drives decline. So it has this arc of a species being exploited and driven extinct. And it also has some origins within Wabanaki culture, because the article written by Manly Hardy was prompted by the discovery of sea mink skulls and shell heaps along the Maine coast. So that shows that these animals and people had been interacting for centuries along Penobscot Bay. And finally, it's from a trapper's perspective, and so much of Maine's history relates to working the land and working the sea since settler times. So having that first-person account of someone who was out there handling stinky mink furs is a key part of the timeline in Maine's history.
Mm-hmm. I think something that strikes me about this entry too is what you've mentioned is the stench. And there is a sensory aspect to what is missing. Maybe perhaps the better known aspect of the better known sensory aspect is sound that Maya has talked about before. And in her site-specific installations, for example, the listening cone in San Francisco or the sound ring at Cornell, those are all about sound. Viewers are kind of, they encounter a work of art, and what they do is not only see it, but hear it. These works play sounds of species, and Maya always likes to talk about the sound of the loon and how haunting it is, and how even just that sound will allow you to connect emotionally. And so what we have here in this timeline is, obviously you can't hear anything, and what you have is these images and this text, but if you actually read the text, you'll get a sense of that sensory as well. This is one example, that stinky mink is one example. Another one is along the Androscoggin, the smell of the sulfur was so bad that people just began to leave the area. And this was in, I think, the 1960s or 70s. And so you get sounds and smells as you're reading through this timeline. Helen, how about you? What highlight would you like to share?
My favorite entry, we could go to the next slide, is from 1931, and it's called "The Creation of Baxter State Park." And the quote is actually from the 53rd governor of Maine, Percival Baxter. And I'll read the quote. It says, "Man is born to die, his works are short-lived, buildings crumble, monuments decay, wealth vanishes, but Katahdin in all its glory forever shall remain the mountain of the people of Maine." And one element of this that I think is really exciting is this painting comes from Colby's museum's collection, and it's by Virgil Williams, and it's titled "Mount Katahdin from the West Branch of the Penobscot." And I think just the pair of this quote with this image is one that I really love and find pretty poetic. And I also really like, Maya calls this project her fifth and final memorial to the environment, which is an idea that's kind of stuck with me a lot throughout this research and this year. And I think just the way that this quote talks about landscape and kind of connecting that with the way that even when we're all gone and all of the world's monuments have been made, kind of the environment and the earth will be the only thing left. And it kind of calls on us to recognize how important that is, and the importance of protecting it and appreciating its glory. And
Yeah, it really encapsulates kind of the feeling of what is missing. Yeah. If you go to the next slide, please. My highlight for this whole timeline is actually not one. I'm cheating. I'm choosing two. Is the bookends. The very first entry, which talks about the origin story of the Wabanaki and how Glooskap shot a bow and arrow into the ash tree, and from that tree poured out humans. And so the ash tree is really central to Wabanaki culture and history. And the last entry is actually about the invasive ash borer beetle threatening traditional basket making. And the image that we've chosen here is Jeremy Frey's basket, which is actually also in the Colby Museum's collection. And we use this image with his permission. This is one of those examples where you can only use images if they're in the public domain. In the more recent image, you have to ask for permission. And thankfully, thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy gave us permission. And it's a beautiful basket. And so, what the story is, if the ash tree is so central to the Wabanaki culture and history, now the ash tree is being threatened because of this invasive species, because of the emerald ash borer. And so you'll see the quote there. Jeremy is talking about that threat. And he says, "I harvest twice the ash I'm going to use. I do that because I know that we can't stop them being the emerald ash borer." Jeremy believes that brown ash will be gone in 15 years. And he hopes that he'll have stockpiled as much as a decade's worth of material by then. It's thousands of years of native technology gone. It's a very poignant quote. And so that's why, it makes for a really good bookend with our first entry. And the other thing too is we keep talking about this as a Maine environmental history timeline. And when we think of history, we often think of it as something that has passed. But what is missing is not just about the past. It's meant to illuminate that history, but it's also very much, in a sense, incomplete. It's still going on. It's an ongoing history. And it's not as if we've presented a timeline that's neatly buttoned up and that oh, conservation success, great, terrific. It's actually, we've chosen to end on a threat, on something that we can do something about, as far as this timeline is concerned. But as far as the original 80 entries, we could only
came from. Although he fished from his boat off the coast of Maine and took salmon fishing vacations in Canada, he usually threw back his catch or gave it to Secret Service agents before going inside to chow down on beef jerky, nachos, chili, or barbecued ribs. And just the vision of someone throwing a salmon away and going and indulging in a plate of greasy, cheesy nachos is so dubious and improbable. I don't think the quote relates to our experience of Maine or what we've gotten from this project, but it provides a counter perspective.
It provides a Texan's perspective, and I can say that. Okay, well, thank you all, thank you both. I just want to congratulate the two of you on the research you did this year and for this beautiful installation. Your work is now up, and really, congratulations. And I also wanted to extend my thank you to Maya and Casey and Alex, of course, and Kara Kugelmeyer and Gail for the partnership that made this internship possible in the Buck Lab. And I feel very honored to have been part of this team. So thank you all. With that, we'll turn to Q&A.
We have a question from Catherine Jumper, who asks, were the dams that were deconstructed made by man or animal? And what were the after effects of the dams being gone? How did it help the environment?
The dams were constructed by people. I'm sure there are, I'm not sure how many dams total have been removed in Maine, but the lower reaches of the Kennebec and the Penobscot have both seen dam removals. And the ecological impacts appear to be pretty immediate. Many species of sea-run fish that either spawn or spend some part of their life cycles up in the freshwater reaches of those rivers were, for the first time in 100 years, able to return and spawn and carry out these life cycles, from like shad to alewives and salmon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing to add about that is actually it's part of the Wabanaki story that's featured on this timeline is related to dams. We have one entry from the 18th century, Chief Poland, a Wabanaki leader, traveling down to Boston and asking the governor, you know, these dams are actually affecting our lives. We don't have fish to eat. Can you at least make a hole in a dam to let the fish pass through? And so that's not only is it affecting the fish, but it's also affecting kind of the communities that rely on that fish to survive.
We have an additional question, and I would also note that we also have a microphone for questions from the audience. But this question is, what are you hoping the public takes away from this installation?
I would say I hope that they develop a bit of an emotional connection to a lot of these entries, and kind of feel responsible for all of the subjects featured in some way. And I think I also hope that kind of the key issues that we established in the overview and the conservation groups and environmental groups that we had kind of pointed our audience towards, that people will kind of do their best to be in contact and kind of try and aid them.
Mm-hmm.
In my personal experience of working on this timeline and learning more about Maine's environmental history, I've developed interests or attachments to places within Maine, and I think it's really shaped the way that I move through the state. I dragged a friend of mine to a dam removal site this spring and just was telling her all about it. And to someone who wasn't aware, it was just a stretch of river, but seeing monuments within the state of Maine, just the absence or presence of species and structures is one element that I've taken away. And I think that looking through this timeline, you can see the locations of each entry and start to think about how your perception of that place relates to earlier perceptions of that place, and telescope through time, and maybe develop that attachment to something in the state of Maine.
I also remember when in the spring we were looking at the regional timelines in the West, and you had seen the butterfly that reminded you of like a place in California that you missed. And I think there's so many entries within this timeline that have the ability to connect with different people, even if it's not like a specific species. I think like even I have kind of developed little emotional attachments to certain entries, even though I haven't had like a physical experience with them in person.
I think, just to add to that, I think that's both what you said I agree with, and I think something that hopefully the public can walk away with once they look through this timeline is specific feelings, you know, like when I say like develop an emotional connection to, that can seem very vague, but different entries will give you different feelings. I think when you read about a species going extinct, obviously you're going to feel sad, but there are also other entries here that will give you hope. Um, there are entries here, especially about the dam removals and about things like being restored. There's one entry about, you know, healing the river's soul, you know, that feels really impactful. And I think this goes back even to a program we previously had at the Lunder Institute, and talking about the connection to land. It's not just like an appreciation of land, but a responsibility to it. And I think that's what I'm hoping people get out of it, is not only a sense of hope, but a feeling of responsibility.
Thank you so much for this amazing work. And I'm curious if at all this experience or this project has changed your perception of the role of artists in terms of as agents of change in the world.
Did you say the role of artist?
Artists.
Artists.
It's hard to hear through a mask.
That's true.
You can see in the early maps and sketches these imaginative takes on their surroundings, on the artist's surroundings, and a responsibility to document that, and a curiosity about the environment as well. And yeah, I think that the paintings and the sketches, as opposed to the photographs, you can see someone's hand as they made that and thought about that scene and put so much time into developing the image, which, similar to the quote, there is those artistic images tell you a lot about the person and who was there and what it was like, that aren't immediately the first things you catch on to, but show some of their feeling and their imagination and their reality.
What about Maya? Like Maya's role in all of this?
I think Maya has really opened my eyes in terms of the ways, well, because she studied architecture in undergrad, I think I'm particularly inspired by her, and just kind of the way that she's interpreted her career in this way and taken responsibility for things that she didn't necessarily study, but that she has interest in and that she's passionate about. And I think she's definitely shown me that like there's so much to being an artist, and so many ways to communicate your ideas. And I think that kind of goes back to the relationship between the images and the textual components, because these things kind of resonate with different people in different ways, and some people are much more visual, whereas other people are more influenced by a quote. And I think she understands that, and yeah.
The artist also has a responsibility, like in creating a timeline, to push you towards action and leave the future a little bit open. Like with the last entry, there is a huge threat to brown ash trees, but it's not set in stone. And as you navigate the entire timeline, you become attached to certain elements, and the artist pushes you to care and to want to support causes that would protect the brown ash tree, so they can really guide engagement with issues like environmental degradation and really personal responses to that.
Yeah, this project advocates for something. It's not just an aesthetic work to be looked at and enjoyed. There's something to be done. And I think something that has made me really think about that question, the role of an artist in society, also is just that it's multiple roles. It's not just one role. And it's actually also multiple people. It's not just one artist. This whole thing was collaborative from the start. I mean, we could say, "What is Missing" by Maya Lin, but actually that's not what it is. It's the Maine Environmental History Timeline by all these people. And so that kind of collaborative spirit and that generosity was really, really kind of amazing to witness and to be a part of. Maya was very, very generous throughout this whole thing.
Thank you, and congrats on this amazing achievement. I have a question to anyone. What was the most egregious or shocking example from What is Missing that you've encountered in your research? And what is the most hopeful initiative in terms of conservation that you encountered maybe in the recent, few decades that you did in research and What is Missing?
To start with, the conservation success that seems most important to me would possibly be the 4 dam removals on the Penobscot River, opening 100 miles of habitat for sea run fish, and just going back to that theme of dams, like a huge initiative with so many different groups collaborating and allowing the resurgence of fish and cultural traditions.
I would say the entries that I find most surprising are probably the ones relating to bounty, just because of kind of like the shifting baselines and the ways that I've gotten used to interacting with the environment. And I think a lot of those kind of tend to catch me off guard, kind of like what you were saying before about like the 6-foot-long lobster. I think sometimes it's just like, I can't even believe that sounds insane. So I think, yeah, ones like that for me.
And how recklessly people used resources. In the Midwest Timeline, we have an entry about when the railways expanded westward, people used that as a platform for sport for shooting buffalo more quickly. And there was, I can't remember the specifics of the quote, but there's a great image with it. And it's just a bunch of men on a rail car with guns and like heaps of slain buffalo lying on the sides. And that quote was super surprising to me and illuminates these patterns of development and settlement driving species declines and really shaping the environment. And that was one connection that I had not seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Another entry that I remember from the Midwest that I don't think I actually included, but I remember reading it when we were going through the website was, I can't remember the city that it was in, but the mayor of the town like scooped up some of the water from like a polluted lake and drank it to try and prove to the people of the town that it was not contaminated, even though it obviously was. And I thought that was kind of a strange length to go to kind of sweep problems under the rug.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's this very idea of abundance that leads to scarcity. It's like, we have so much of it. I put my hand in the water and like I'm just surrounded by fish. It's just that very idea, like, we see that, we're like, how can that be? That's not the way it is now. But it's precisely because of that idea that everybody thought like, well, we have so much, let's use it all. And that's how something gets depleted. So it's kind of really ironic when you see these entries about abundance and then you realize it's that very attitude that led to the way things are now.
You've very expertly answered questions that have come in, but I have a question. So you've worked on this Maine timeline quite intensively, and it didn't exist before, and now you're working on regional timelines. Is there something that you have found to be distinctive about your Maine research that the other regions haven't encompassed, or have you felt that they're more about resonances between them?
one element of that, I think Cal and I have found, or at least curating the Maine timeline down, we had a more of an understanding of what key issues actually were necessary to include. And I think for like the Midwest, certainly we were less sure about kind of what elements to highlight. So that was definitely a difference.
To me, just the process of doing research in place, immersed in Maine, and having the more of the original texts available. I'm not sure if the output is any different, but my relationship with the entries and the quotes, I can trace that back to actually flipping through a book, or that primary research that we didn't quite get with the other timelines, but those required different skills. And yeah, I guess we'll all have to wait and see on the new website. And does the Maine timeline resonate differently than the West, or what?
Yeah, and the What Is Missing team is working right now as we speak to relaunch that new website, and I think in about a week or so. Okay, I think that's it. So for the in-person audience, I would like to invite you to take a closer look at the Maine timeline installed here. And for the virtual audience, even though you can't be here in person and can't see the installation on the wall, we've prepared a slideshow for you to see. It lasts about 15 minutes so that you can have time and look at each entry. So stick around. Thank you all.